Under the bright lights of a sold-out stadium, a spectacle unlike anything the world had ever seen was about to unfold. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation, a mix of roaring cheers and stunned whispers filling the air as fans struggled to comprehend the gravity of what they were witnessing. On one side of the arena stood a man who had conquered the octagon with his ferocious left hand and razor-sharp tongue. His presence alone was enough to send shockwaves through the crowd. Opposite him, a legend of an entirely different kind, arguably the fastest man to ever grace the earth, a symbol of effortless speed and dominance on the track. Two titans, masters of their respective domains, now locked in a face-off that defied all logic. This wasn't just about sport. It wasn't about medals or championship belts. It was about something far more primal: pride, legacy, and the question on everyone's lips: who was the ultimate competitor? The journey to this moment had begun long before the world took notice. It started as a playful exchange, a harmless social media jab that escalated into something no one could have foreseen. What had been a friendly challenge quickly spiraled into a full-blown rivalry, with egos too large to let it die down. The notion seemed ridiculous at first. What business did a fighter have competing against a sprinter, and vice versa? But when two icons refuse to back down, when the fire of competition burns too fiercely to ignore, the impossible suddenly starts to feel inevitable. And now, as they stood on opposite ends of the battlefield, one with fists clenched, the other with muscles coiled like a loaded spring, the world could do nothing but watch in stunned disbelief. No one had believed it would actually come to this. The idea had been tossed around like a wild fantasy, dismissed by analysts and experts as nothing more than entertainment fodder. Even the athletes themselves had laughed at the thought until the stakes got real. A simple wager had transformed into a multi-million-dollar event, drawing the attention of the sporting world, the media, and even those who had never cared for combat or sprinting before. Promoters saw dollar signs, fans saw an unmissable spectacle, and the two men at the center of it saw only one thing: an opportunity to prove their dominance in a way no one could ever question again. Both had built their careers on proving doubters wrong. One had risen from the gritty streets of Dublin, fighting his way through adversity to become the face of mixed martial arts. He thrived on pressure, on the roar of the crowd, on the knowledge that every moment in the spotlight could make or break his legacy. The other had shattered records with a grin on his face, making the impossible look effortless, rewriting history with every step he took. Speed was his weapon, his gift, his unchallenged domain. They were opposites in many ways, one defined by power and precision, the other by grace and speed. But in this moment, all differences faded away. The only thing that mattered was proving to the world who truly reigned supreme. As the event neared, the tension between them became almost unbearable. Press conferences turned into verbal battles. Interviews were laced with subtle and not-so-subtle digs. Every stare down felt like a fight in itself. The world watched as they pushed themselves to the limits, training in ways no one had ever expected. A sprinter testing his ability to withstand the ferocity of combat. A fighter attempting to tap into levels of speed he had never needed before. They weren't just preparing for a competition. They were reshaping themselves, evolving into something more. Then, the night arrived. The energy inside the stadium was electric, an unrelenting force that pulsed through the air like a heartbeat. Fans had debated for months, breaking down every possible outcome, but no one truly knew what was about to happen. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every bead of sweat, every flicker of focus in their eyes. One last moment of silence before the madness began. And then, as the clock struck the fateful hour, the referee signaled for the start. The first sound was a sharp clap, the signal that it had begun. In an instant, the world watched as these two forces of nature exploded into motion, their bodies coiled with the kind of intensity that only comes from absolute determination. But what no one expected was the hesitation, that split second where instinct fought against training, where muscle memory collided with an unfamiliar challenge. The fighter, built to react in combat, twitched forward as if anticipating an attack that never came. The sprinter, conditioned to explode off the starting block, hesitated for just a fraction of a second, as if reminding himself this wasn't just about speed. And in that moment of uncertainty, everything changed. To understand how they reached this moment, you have to go back to where it all started. It was never meant to be anything more than a casual challenge. A playful remark in an interview, a question posed half seriously, could the world's fastest man outrun a punch? Could the most feared striker in combat sports land a blow before a sprinter could escape? It was a hypothetical, something fans would debate over drinks but never expect to see play out in reality. But then came the response. The sprinter, never one to shy away from a challenge, laughed it off at first. But then he fired back. Not just with words, but with a promise if they ever stood face to face, he'd make his opponent look slow. That was all it took. One claim, one moment of confidence, and suddenly, the challenge had a life of its own. What followed was a whirlwind of speculation and disbelief. Sports analysts dismissed it as a gimmick, something that would never see the light of day. But the fans? They couldn't get enough. Every interview, every press conference, every social media post only added fuel to the fire. The sprinter had always been seen as untouchable in his element, a man who made the impossible look effortless. He had beaten the best in the world with a smile, setting records that seemed superhuman. But in this new arena, away from the comfort of the track, could he still be the fastest? Could he still dominate when the rules weren't written in his favor? On the other side, the fighter was used to challenges. He had built his career on them, thrived on the doubters who said he would never make it. Every fight, every press conference, every stare-down was another battle in a war against expectation. He had faced giants in the octagon, men who wanted nothing more than to knock him down and erase his legacy. But this was different. He wasn't just fighting another man. He was fighting an idea that speed alone could make a man untouchable. And that was something he couldn't accept. The event became bigger than anyone had expected. What had started as a fantasy became a multi-million-dollar spectacle, drawing attention from every corner of the sports world. Fighters, runners, trainers, and analysts all weighed in, each one convinced they had the answer. Some said it was obvious the sprinter had spent his entire life perfecting speed, and no one, no matter how fast their fists were, could ever hope to match him in that regard. Others argued that speed without control meant nothing, that a fighter trained to react, to anticipate, to cut off angles, could close the gap faster than anyone realized. The debate raged on, growing louder with each passing day, until there was only one way to settle it. Behind the scenes, both men prepared in ways no one had expected. The sprinter's training was unlike anything he had done before. Gone were the strict lane lines, the comfort of a straight path with no obstacles. Now he trained in chaos, dodging, weaving, pushing his reflexes beyond their limit. He worked with fighters, learning how to read movement, how to predict the unpredictable. He knew he couldn't match his opponent in combat, but if he could move fast enough, if he could escape before danger ever reached him, then he wouldn't have to. The fighter's training was no less intense. He had always been fast for his sport, quick with his hands, sharp with his counters. But this was something else entirely. He wasn't just training to fight, he was training to hunt. He studied movement, watched hours of footage, analyzing every step his opponent had ever taken on the track. He knew that pure speed alone wouldn't be enough to catch a man who had spent his entire life perfecting the art of running. But speed with strategy, that was a different story. The night of the event arrived with an energy that was impossible to ignore. The arena was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Fans from both worlds had come together, their excitement mixing with an undercurrent of disbelief. No one knew what to expect. It was uncharted territory, a battle that defied every rule of conventional sport. The lights dimmed, the music blasted, and the two men stepped forward, each carrying the weight of his own legacy. As the match began, the first moments were filled with uncertainty. Both had trained, both had prepared, but nothing could truly replicate the reality of the fight. The sprinter moved first, his reflexes honed to perfection. He darted to the side, avoiding the first feint with a burst of speed that made the crowd gasp. But the fighter didn't lunge. He didn't chase blindly. He watched, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment. Seconds passed like hours, the tension mounting with each step, each feint, each calculated move. The crowd held its breath, unsure of who would strike first, who would make the mistake that changed everything. And then, in the blink of an eye, the balance shifted. A single movement, a flicker of hesitation, a step in the wrong direction, and suddenly, the fight was no longer just a test of speed. The moment of hesitation was barely noticeable, but to a trained eye, it was everything. The sprinter, conditioned to react in fractions of a second, shifted his weight ever so slightly, his instinct telling him to evade. But in that split second, the fighter saw what he had been waiting for: a pattern, a predictable movement. And in the world of combat, predictability was a weakness. With lightning-fast precision, he lunged forward, fists coiled, ready to close the distance before the sprinter could escape again. The crowd erupted as the tension finally broke, the first real clash about to unfold. But just as contact seemed inevitable, something shocking happened. The sprinter didn't just dodge, he anticipated. Instead of retreating like before, he made an unexpected move, cutting at an angle no one saw coming. It wasn't just speed, it was intelligence, adaptability. And suddenly, the fighter was off balance, just slightly, but enough for the sprinter to seize an opportunity of his own. He didn't strike. He didn't engage in combat that wasn't his game. But in that brief window, he did something far more dangerous. He played with the fighter's own strength against him. The crowd gasped as the fighter overextended, his momentum carrying him just past the mark, his own aggression turned into a liability. The sprinter, impossibly fast, was already gone, circling back before the fighter could adjust. It was a moment that defied expectations, proving that this wasn't just about avoiding blows, it was about outthinking, outmaneuvering, making an opponent fight on unfamiliar terms. And for the first time, doubt flickered in the fighter's expression. He was no stranger to competition, but he had always dictated the pace of battle. This time, the pace was out of his control. The energy inside the arena shifted. What had seemed like an eventual chase and catch scenario now felt like a high-stakes game of chess, played at blistering speed. The sprinter, confident now, began pushing further, taunting with movements so quick they seemed unreal. He danced just within reach, only to disappear again before the fighter could react. It wasn't just a display of athleticism, it was a challenge, a mental game designed to frustrate and provoke. The fighter clenched his fists, recalculating, knowing that frustration led to mistakes. And then the real twist came. Just when it seemed the sprinter had control, when it looked like this would be a game of evasion until the clock ran out, the fighter did something no one expected. He stopped chasing. He stopped reacting. Instead, he planted his feet and waited, a smirk creeping across his face. It was a trap. The sprinter, used to an opponent constantly lunging forward, now found himself in unfamiliar territory. He had thrived on movement, on forcing mistakes, but now there was nothing to react to. For the first time, the fighter dictated the pace. The sprinter hesitated, the shift catching him off guard. The fighter had spent the entire match lunging, pressing forward. Now, he was still calculated, daring the sprinter to make the first move. And that's when the tension in the arena reached its peak. The crowd, the analysts, even those watching from home, everyone realized the same thing at the same time. It wasn't just about speed anymore. It wasn't just about reaction time. It was about strategy. And in that moment, both men knew the real fight had just begun. Neither man moved. The arena, once deafening, fell into an uneasy silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The sprinter shifted ever so slightly, the tiniest twitch of his foot, searching for the right angle, the perfect opening. But the fighter, a master of reading opponents, caught it instantly. A barely perceptible smirk formed on his lips. This was the moment he had been waiting for. It was no longer about speed. It was about control, about dictating who made the first mistake. Then, In the blink of an eye, the sprinter exploded forward. It was a move faster than anything the crowd had seen all night, a burst of raw power that left nothing to chance. He was going all in, betting everything on one final play. But the fighter, calm as ever, had already anticipated it. His feet pivoted, body coiling with precision honed through years of battle. He didn't just react, he was ahead of it. The moment the sprinter committed to his movement, the fighter struck. The impact wasn't what anyone expected. There was no knockout punch, no dramatic takedown. Instead, the fighter's outstretched hand caught nothing but air. The sprinter had seen it at the last possible second and twisted his body just enough to avoid disaster. But in doing so, he lost balance. His momentum, once his greatest weapon, betrayed him. One misstep, one overcorrection, and suddenly his footing was gone. The audience gasped as he stumbled, struggling to regain control. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one he had never experienced on a track, where every movement was calculated and precise. The fighter didn't need to strike, gravity had done the work for him. In a matter of seconds, the sprinter was on the ground, hands planted, eyes wide with shock. Not from pain, but from realization. The fighter stepped back, fists still raised, but he didn't need to do anything more. The fight was over. The rules had been unspoken from the beginning. This wasn't about knocking the other man out. It was about proving dominance, proving who controlled the game. And as the sprinter sat there, breathing heavily, staring at the man who had outmaneuvered him in the end, he understood. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of frustration, instead of anger, the sprinter grinned. A slow, knowing smile that spread across his face as he let out a breathless chuckle. He had spent his entire life outrunning competition, breaking records that seemed untouchable. But here, in an arena outside his world, he had finally met someone who didn't need to keep up with his speed because they had made him stop instead. The fighter extended a hand. No words were exchanged, but none were needed. The sprinter took it, pulled himself up, and the two men locked eyes for a brief moment of mutual respect. The crowd erupted, not in celebration for a winner, but in appreciation of what they had just witnessed. This wasn't about one man defeating the other. It was about two legends pushing each other to their limits in ways no one had ever imagined. As the lights dimmed and the event came to a close, one final question remained. Would there be a rematch? Would the world see these two face off again, this time with new strategies, new adaptations? The fighter smirked. The sprinter nodded knowingly, and without saying a word, they left the world wondering. One thing was certain, this was not the last time these two forces would collide.